A woman lands a new job, a fresh start, a chance to earn a living, a chance to build a better future, but just 2 days later, she's dead. Not missing, not injured, dead. And for more than a month, her family doesn't even know. No phone call, no message, no goodbye. Instead, Susan Wanjiku Nyambura's body sits in a city mortuary as an unidentified person, while the woman police believe may hold the answers disappears without a trace. How does someone start a new job on a Monday and end up dead before the week is over? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what happened inside that house in Kasarani? I'm Wanja, and this is Crime Dopers, where crime meets truth.
Twisted tales in every folder. Truth runs hot while the trail gets colder. Crime Dopers, we don't look away.
Welcome back, Crime Dopers. Thank you for joining me for another episode. Today's case is heartbreaking. It's disturbing. And honestly, it leaves behind more questions than answers. We're talking about the murder of 35-year-old Susan Wanjiku Nyambura, a nanny, a house manager, a woman who left home hopeful after securing a new job. But according to investigators, Susan would only spend 2 days at that workplace before losing her life. What followed was a mystery involving an abandoned apartment, a brutal crime scene, a missing employer, and a family desperately searching for answers. As we go through this story, keep one thing in mind. Susan was not found because someone came forward. Susan was not identified because a loved one reported her missing. Her family only learned she was dead after a forensic fingerprint match connected her body to her identity. That detail alone tells you how complicated and tragic this case is. So, let's start at the beginning. In May of 2026, Susan Wanjiku Nyambura accepted what appeared to be a normal domestic work opportunity. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just a job. For many people working as nannies and house managers in Nairobi, securing employment can mean the difference between survival and hardship. Friends and family later described Susan as a hardworking woman trying to improve her life. She reportedly began working at a home in the Clay City area of Kasarani. By all accounts, this should have been a routine transition, a new employer, a new environment, a new chapter. But investigators believe Susan's life came to an end between May 11th and May 12th, just 2 days after she started. Think about that for a second. 2 days, 48 hours. That's barely enough time to unpack your belongings, barely enough time to learn the routine of a household, barely enough time to know the people you're living with. Yet somewhere within those 2 days, something happened. Something violent, something deadly. And what makes this case particularly unsettling is that no immediate alarm was raised, no emergency calls, no reports from the employer, no rush to seek medical help. Instead, according to investigators, the situation unfolded in complete silence. Now, you have to ask yourself, what could happen inside a home that causes a person to disappear so completely that their family spends weeks not knowing they're dead? Because that's exactly what happened here. The next chapter of this story begins with a scene that detectives will later describe as deeply disturbing. When officers eventually gained access to the residence in the Clay City area of Kasarani, they weren't walking into an ordinary home. Something was wrong. Very wrong. At the entrance of the residence lay the body of Susan Wanjiku Nyambura, a woman who just days earlier had arrived there hoping to start a new chapter in her life. But investigators quickly realized that the doorway wasn't where the violence had started. In fact, evidence suggested the opposite. Inside the house, detectives reportedly found signs that pointed to a violent confrontation, bloodstains, signs of a struggle, furniture that appeared displaced, indicators that something chaotic had unfolded within those walls. And perhaps most chilling of all, there was no one there to explain any of it. The person who should have been able to answer the most basic questions, the employer, was nowhere to be found. No report had been made. No emergency services had been called. No attempt appeared to have been made to notify Susan's family. The house was silent, and that silence spoke volumes. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the investigators for a moment. You arrive at a residence, you find a deceased woman, evidence suggests violence, the person most closely connected to the scene has disappeared. Where do you even begin? Because every unanswered question creates three more. What triggered the confrontation? Who was present when it happened? How long did it last? And perhaps most importantly, could Susan have been saved if help had arrived sooner? Those are difficult questions, and unfortunately, the evidence available paints a grim picture. A post-mortem examination later determined that Susan died from severe blunt force trauma. The injuries were extensive, the kind of injuries that indicate tremendous force, the kind of injuries that leave investigators convinced this was not a simple accident. Additional bruising found on parts of her body suggested there may have been a struggle before her death, a terrifying final fight for survival. And when you think about that, it's hard not to feel a lump in your throat, because Susan was completely alone, far from home, in a workplace she had barely settled into, among people she hardly knew, no familiar faces, no relatives nearby, no one who could immediately raise an alarm when something went wrong. And here's another detail that investigators reportedly considered significant. The condition of the scene suggested that what had happened wasn't something that could easily be hidden. This wasn't a minor incident. The violence left traces, evidence, questions, the kind of questions forensic investigators spent weeks trying to answer. Every stain, every mark, every object inside that apartment became a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle that detectives are still trying to fully reconstruct. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this discovery isn't what investigators found, it's what happened afterward. Because after Susan died, life outside that apartment continued as normal. People went to work, children went to school, traffic filled Nairobi roads, and all the while, Susan remained unidentified. Her loved ones had no idea that tragedy had struck, no idea that detectives were standing in a crime scene trying to understand her final moments, no idea that the woman they expected to hear from again would never make that call. The investigation was now underway, but the victim still had no name. And for investigators, solving a murder without immediately knowing who the victim is can be incredibly challenging. You can't trace their last conversations, you can't speak to relatives, you can't build a complete timeline. Everything becomes harder, everything becomes slower, and in this case, that delay would prove devastating, because while detectives were gathering evidence from the scene, Susan's family was beginning a completely different journey, one filled with confusion, concern, and growing worry, a worry that would eventually lead them to a truth far worse than anything they could have imagined.
Tulipata hii information kutoka kwa DCI, tukaambiwa tukuje tu confirm mwili kama ni wa sister yetu,
na tumepata alichapwa, aligongwa kichwa. So hiyo ndio ripoti yenye tumepata kutoka kwa postmortem. So aliuliwa.
For Susan's family, the weeks that followed her disappearance didn't begin with panic. They began with assumptions, reasonable assumptions, the kind most of us would make. After all, Susan had just started a new job. New jobs are demanding. New environments take adjustment. Sometimes people get busy, sometimes they forget to call, sometimes they simply need time to settle in. At first, there was no reason to believe anything terrible had happened. No one was knocking on the family's door. No police officer was making inquiries. No hospital was calling. Nothing. Just silence. But as the days stretched on, that silence started to feel heavier, more uncomfortable, more difficult to explain. Calls reportedly went unanswered. Messages received no response. The familiar patterns that family members had come to know simply disappeared. And when someone you love suddenly stops communicating, you start searching for explanations. Maybe her phone got lost. Maybe she traveled unexpectedly. Maybe she's overwhelmed with work. You tell yourself these things because the alternative is too frightening to consider. But eventually, concern began replacing optimism. The uncertainty became impossible to ignore. And that's one of the cruelest aspects of this case. Susan's family wasn't grieving yet. They were waiting for a phone call, waiting for a message, waiting for an explanation. What they didn't know was that the answers they were searching for were already in the hands of investigators. The connection simply hadn't been made, because at that point, authorities were facing a major obstacle. They had a victim, but they didn't have an identity. And in homicide investigations, identity is often the starting point. Once investigators know who the victim is, they can begin mapping out their life, who they spoke to, where they lived, who last saw them alive, who might want to harm them. But when a victim remains unidentified, those investigative pathways become much harder to follow. Every day that passes becomes another lost opportunity, another delay, another piece of time that can never be recovered. So, while Susan's family was searching for answers from one direction, investigators were searching from another, neither side realizing how close they were to each other. Then came the breakthrough, not from a witness, not from a confession, not from a tip, from science, from fingerprints. At some point during the investigation, officers from the DCI fingerprint department began the process of identifying the unknown woman. It's a painstaking procedure, one that often receives little public attention, but in cases like this, it can become the key that unlocks everything. Investigators compared the fingerprints against official records, and eventually, a match appeared. Suddenly, the unknown woman had a name: Susan Wanjiku Nyambura, 35 years old, a daughter, a sister, a human being whose story was beginning to emerge from the shadows. Imagine being the officer who sees that match appear on the screen. In an instant, the investigation changes. The victim is no longer anonymous. They are now people who need to be informed, questions that need to be asked, lives that are about to change forever. And then came the phone call, the call that every family dreads, the kind of call that divides life into two parts, before and after. For Susan's sisters, the news was unimaginable. For weeks, they had been searching for an explanation. Now they had one, but it wasn't the explanation they wanted. The woman they had been hoping to hear from was gone. Not missing, not unreachable, gone forever. And adding to the heartbreak was the realization that this tragedy had happened weeks earlier, while they were hoping, while they were waiting, while they were wondering where Susan was. She had already lost her life. That realization is difficult to process. Many families describe receiving news like this as feeling unreal, as if time suddenly stops, as if the world around them continues moving while they remain frozen in place. Questions begin flooding the mind. When did it happen? Was she suffering? Was she scared? Could anything have been done to save her? Why didn't anyone tell us sooner? Why did this happen at all? Questions that often have no immediate answers, and yet, even in their grief, Susan's family found themselves entering a new reality. The waiting was over. But the fight for justice was just beginning, because now investigators had a victim with a name, a family demanding answers, a growing collection of forensic evidence, and a suspect who was still nowhere to be found. The mystery had entered an entirely new phase. The question was no longer, who is the victim? The question now was, where is the person detectives believe may know exactly what happened inside that house?
Kuna mjamaa alikuwa na pikipiki, alikuwa ameshuka sehemu fulani, alikuwa anaelekea, ni kama alikuwa anabeba customer. So mama akamuita, kuna mama alikuwa amemuita kwa ploti, so hatukujua ni nini. Ile kutembea kiasi nikasikia jamaa akisema hapana, mimi sitaweza. So all of a sudden nikasikia kuna mama akapiga nduru, kataka confirm nini inaendelea. Kwa kuja tukaangalia, tukapata kuna mwanadada ameaga dunia. Jaribu ku find out sababu ya kwa mwanadada ni nini ameaga dunia, nini ama chanzo ni nini. Msichana hakuwa amemaliza hata siku 2 kwa hiyo nyumba, ikawa alikuwa ameuliwa na boss wake.
Atarudi na akirudi anarudi akiwa amevaa buibui. Sasa mwezi jua, hata mkifungua tu gate muone mtu amevaa buibui, mtajua ni yeye. Sasa mjue mko kwa hatari.
This lady is not the first time, no, she's not the first time kufanya hizi sarakasi. And amekuwa the other day, kuna wakati aligonga bwanake na kisu, kuna kijana amekana na yeye. Kazi imekuwa ni kufurugana. Kuna mfanyikazi the other day amekaa siku 2 ametushia vitu nje. So ni mtu amekuwa na drama mingi sana hata kwa hii area.
By the time investigators identified Susan Wanjiku Nyambura, the case had already become far more complicated than a typical homicide investigation, because detectives weren't just trying to determine what happened, they were trying to determine who was missing from this story. And one name kept appearing at the center of the inquiries: the employer, the woman who had hired Susan only days before her death. The woman investigators desperately wanted to question, the woman who, according to police, was nowhere to be found. And suddenly, this case transformed. What had started as the investigation of an unidentified victim became a race against time, because every hour that passes after a suspect disappears creates new challenges. Witness memories begin to fade, potential evidence can be lost, digital trails become colder, and investigators are forced to play catch-up. According to reports, detectives soon learned that the employer had allegedly left the area shortly after Susan's death. Not days later, not weeks later, shortly afterward. And that detail immediately raised concern, because from an investigative perspective, timing matters a lot. When someone leaves immediately after a violent death occurs in a location connected to them, detectives naturally want to know why. Where were they going? Who helped them? What did they know? And perhaps most importantly, what were they trying to avoid? Those are the kinds of questions that drive homicide investigations forward. But at that stage, investigators still need evidence, not assumptions, not rumors, evidence. So detectives began doing what investigators do best. They started building a timeline, piece by piece, hour by hour, movement by movement, trying to reconstruct the final known events before Susan's death. And somewhere within that timeline emerged a potentially significant witness, a border rider. According to reports, the rider was allegedly approached on the night investigators believed the murder occurred. The details remain limited, but what has captured public attention is what happened next. The rider reportedly chose not to get involved. Instead, he left, but later found himself speaking with investigators. Now, that might sound like a small detail, but often criminal investigations are built upon small details, not dramatic confessions, not movie-style breakthroughs, small moments, small observations, small decisions. A witness noticing unusual behavior, a neighbor hearing something strange, a phone call placed at an unusual hour, a person unexpectedly leaving town. Each detail by itself may seem insignificant, but together they can tell a story. And detectives were now trying to determine exactly where that witness fit into the larger picture. What did he observe? What was happening around the property at the time? Did he notice anyone else present? Did he see signs of panic, signs of urgency, signs that something had gone terribly wrong? Those answers may eventually become important if the case proceeds through the courts. Meanwhile, investigators were expanding their search because locating the employer had become a priority. Reports indicate detectives believed she had moved beyond Nairobi, and that presented an entirely new challenge. Finding someone who does not want to be found can be incredibly difficult, especially when they have time to move, time to change locations, time to rely on relatives, friends, or associates, time to disappear into the background. So, investigators reportedly began following leads wherever they surfaced. Information from witnesses, communication records, movement patterns, potential sightings. Every lead had to be examined. Every possibility had to be explored. Because somewhere out there was a person detectives believed held critical answers. And while police were conducting their search, public interest in the case continued to grow. People wanted answers. How does a woman start a job and die within 48 hours? What happened inside that home? Why did nobody contact her family? Why did it take so long for her loved ones to learn the truth? And why, after all this time, had no one been brought before a court?
Kulingana na sisi hatujaridhika juu huyu mwenye alifanya hii kitendo hajashikwa, na hatuwezi zika mwili before tumuone yeye mwenyewe, tusikie ameshikwa na justice imeonekana. So hakuna vile tunaweza endelea na mazishi as far as hata kama tumejua ni kuchapwa alichapwa. Huyu mwenye alimchapa ako wapi?
The questions kept coming, and for Susan's family, each day without an arrest likely felt like another day without closure. Because grief and uncertainty are a difficult combination. When a family loses someone, they naturally want answers. But when a suspect remains missing, those answers can feel frustratingly out of reach. You know a crime occurred. You know someone is gone. Yet the full story remains incomplete. It's like reading a book with several pages torn out. You can see parts of the narrative, but not the whole picture. And perhaps that's what makes this case so unsettling. There is no clear ending yet. No courtroom testimony, no verdict, no conviction, no final explanation of what happened during Susan's last hours. Just a growing collection of evidence, a determined group of investigators, a grieving family, and a suspect still being sought by authorities. As of this recording, the investigation remains active. Detectives continue pursuing leads. The family continues seeking justice, and the central mystery remains unresolved. What exactly happened behind those closed doors? And when the person at the center of the investigation is finally located, what new truths might emerge? Because somewhere within the unanswered questions lies the story of Susan's final moments. And until those questions are answered, this case remains unfinished. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable realities. Domestic workers often enter private spaces where very few outsiders can see what happens behind closed doors. They care for children, manage homes, support families, yet when something goes wrong, they can become incredibly vulnerable. Susan's story reminds us that every headline represents a human being, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a person with dreams and plans for the future. She accepted a job hoping to build a better future. Instead, her family was left planning a burial. And today, one central question remains: what exactly happened inside that house during those 2 days? Because until that question is fully answered, justice remains unfinished. As we close today's episode, Susan Wanjiku Nyambura deserves to be remembered not as a case number, but as a person whose life mattered. If you have any information related to this investigation, please contact the Directorate of Criminal Investigations or your nearest police station. Even the smallest detail could matter. And today's Crime Dopers life rule is simple. Never ignore prolonged silence from someone you care about. Check in, make the call, send the message, because sometimes that simple act can make all the difference. If you found this episode important, share it. Let's keep Susan's story alive. Let's keep asking questions, and let's keep demanding justice. I'm Wanja, and this has been Crime Dopers, where crime meets truth. Stay safe, stay aware, stay alert, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Crime Dopers. We don't look away.